I just hit recording very
Yeah.
quickly, Sally,
Hmm.
because there's a lot of golden nuggets in the sense of what you're
Oh, thanks.
identifying. And so for our subscribership, what was just in the green room with Sally Loftis, we'll
Hmm.
introduce her in a second, but we're already diving in deep with regards to transparency and trustworthiness. And so, Sally, if you don't mind repeating yourself in the sense of how you show up from a human-centric perspective for your clients, and maybe a little bit about your background as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you. I'm excited to be on here and to be part of this. Kind of how I introduced myself was, I work at the intersection of human resources, organization development, and social justice. And personally, I'm still exploring what's in the middle of that Venn diagram. I don't know everything that's in there, right? I just know those are the passions and where they meet. One piece of that is working in pay equity because I do come from a human resources background. I've actually done I've done research, graduate level research in the area of pay equity. And what I
Amazing.
find is that, whenever you start kind of looking, that's a level of transparency that's coming out in organizations right now, right? Is pay. It's a topic that we've not spoken about, or maybe we talked about with other people we worked with, but like, how many times have you shown up in a team conversation? They're like, let's talk about pay.
No.
I haven't had those experiences, right? It's
Mm-mm.
really been a hush hush topic. So there's a level of kind of building consent in an organizational culture to have transparency. Pay equity is just one piece of that. Obviously, transparency is pretty broad, and can go in different ways. So, I kind of come into an organization. I actually have a newsletter on LinkedIn called Fully Human Resources. And it's really
Mm.
about, we are bringing our whole selves into work now. We always have,
Yes, absolutely.
right? We
But
always
it was just
have.
never socially acceptable, right?
Exactly. And then like, and it's more kind of, in the culture, more acceptance. And then the pandemic, when we all of a sudden, many of us went remote
Hmm.
and we're zooming into each other's living rooms or whatever, we're meeting each other's pets and people in the
Hmm.
house, and things like that. There was a new level of intimacy, right?
Hmm.
And personal, you know i I don't know, personal pieces of our lives coming in there. And that's, people don't want to go back to the, like, I'm going to check my brain at the door and not
Absolutely
use
not.
all of it, or check who I am at the door and not use all of it at work. Everything's kind of integrated now.
And that resonates, Sally. It's almost like we took that professional mask off and then put our business cash mask on, right?
Hmm.
And so it's actually doing the walk of the talk for from the past decade. Because I mean, most organizations have identified, hey, we want to get to know you both personally and professionally, or from a business perspective. But what that really means is we want to, from 9 to 5, understand how you can hit your objectives and ensure that you're operating within the social norms of the organization. That's
Hmm.
not a bad thing. I'm not poo-pooing on that,
Yeah.
but I have a differing thought process as well, and really reside with the concept of a human-centric approach. We are a whole person, and we literally and psychologically cannot check ourselves at the door. And if so, it's not sustainable. That's where a lot of burnout comes in, because it's like, oh my God, I got to fake having all of this energy when my child was just puking all night. And by the way, I can't tell my employer so that I'm not judged or I'd be passed
Hmm.
over by for a promotion, right? There's still a lot of fear
Hmm.
out there. So I think it's really about normalizing, going back to that thought process of transparency and trustworthiness. It's normalizing transparency in the workplace as to, okay, what does that mean for us, team? You know,
Hmm.
as a leader, do I want to know how my team members are showing up virtually or in person on a daily basis? Of course, absolutely. Do we want to roll out the coach? Maybe not. That's what our employee
Hmm.
assistance program is for. But having and breaking down those boundaries around that, it has to be professional and versus personal, and when we go out and have a beer after work, it's not so much a thing anymore. And I'm, quite frankly,
Hmm.
I'm loving it, because that allows a different level of vulnerability. And
Hmm.
backing into that transparency, it can allow for growth, not just from a leadership perspective, but professionally as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it gives us autonomy, which is one of
Mm.
the, key motivators of people, right? It gives us autonomy and choice in our lives. And I think, we used to use the term a work-life balance, which doesn't even like apply anymore. I feel
No.
like it's really kind of whole person integration. And it's,
Yes.
Because people are checking, we have email access on our phones if we choose to do that, or people are working different schedules or
Right.
things like that. And so we have options we can kind of opt in and out of when we want to work at our peak performance times or things like that. If we
Mm,
work in an organization that supports that, right? Not every
mm,
organization supports that.
mm,
So I think for me, what I've experienced is like kind of coming back in person from the pandemic. Like I remember going to my first like full day training where I sat in the training, was not facilitating. And I remember just sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, like I've lost the ability to sit for 8 hours, like, and
mhm.
listen to somebody else. Like I was like, can I not like fold laundry or something while I'm listening to this? Or like, can I be in my pajamas? I mean, it was just like I realized I had to work a muscle back,
Mm,
to kind of be back into some of these things. So I think I've experienced that some of the pushback about being back in the office or even just in in-person events has been
mhm.
like, wait, like we've kind of lost our capability to like, or our endurance to
Right.
do that kind of stuff in like this very kind of pre-formulated, appearance that we need to be in.
Absolutely. And what would you say is the fine balance between that?
Yeah, I think it's just acknowledging where people are, seeing, again, I'm thinking about just kind of the in-person piece of like building an environment, having conversations. I think just as a leader, being able to have a conversation with your team and be like, what do you like about working from home? Or what do you
Mm,
like about working remotely? What do you like about being in the office?
mhm.
And just kind of having that conversation and seeing where people are. And I will also say you may have that conversation and your team is completely silent. And so you may need to have it multiple times to kind of work into, that's a trust building question that people,
Absolutely.
do people feel safe sharing that with you? But and being vulnerable yourself and saying, like I just told you, like I'd much rather sit and watch a training probably in my pajamas and fold laundry than have to sit in a chair all day where other people
Mm,
can see me. So I think there's a level of vulnerability that's required of leaders right now that feels super scary
yes,
for many of us.
definitely.
Yeah, I think it feels super scary, especially kind of coming out of like a volatile and uncertain atmosphere that we've been in for the last few years.
Definitely. And so, kind of taking a step back, everyone, I want to formally introduce us to Sally Loftis. We're so excited to jam today. So, Sally is the managing director of Loftis Partners. Like she had mentioned, she's a human resources consultant, organizational strategist, as well as a trained facilitator. And so, my understanding of Loftis Partners, and you tell your story better than I will for sure, Sally, is that it's a 100% women-owned human resources consulting firm that is based in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, North Carolina is on my bucket list to go see.
Oh, nice.
And essentially what they do is they work virtually and in person, so meeting the clients where they're at and what they need, by way of building capacity within their organization. So they really specialize in strategy, design, facilitations, and pay equity.
Mm-hmm.
But Sally, I'd like to hear what is your favorite thing about Loftus Partners, and kind of what drives you to have that zest every single day with your clients?
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. I will
Mm,
say what I love about Loftus Partners in particular is having my own business.
mm.
I tell people like I'm the best boss I've ever had. And, I mean, just being able to have, kind of that autonomy, that choice. Obviously, there's a lot of risk in starting your
Yes.
own business, right? I love that I'm able also to collaborate with a lot of people. That's why I use the term partner. So I collaborate with different consulting firms or different consultants that come in and work with me on a project. So I'm always kind of working in a new team design with a client. And we do a lot of strategy work, which has always been kind of my draw on the human resources side. I've always worked
Mm,
more on the like, how do the people connect to the business strategy and to the
mhm,
purpose, right? And how do
mhm.
we solidify that partnership, right, with what the business wants to accomplish and the people that are employed to do it. And so I really love working in those spaces of trying to create people positive approaches and practices and organizations, and really changing that paradigm of, people are here to, suck all the money out of us and not
Yeah.
do work, right? Like to really say like people are here because they're amazing and they are working and they chose to come to this organization because they believe in
Hmm.
things that are happening. And so really kind of building on that paradigm.
Absolutely. And can you help us break down a little bit further? What does
Mhm,
people first or people centric approach mean to
mhm,
you,
mhm.
specifically with Loftis Partners?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like every one of your questions I could probably talk for an hour on, so I'm going to try to be really, short in those. I think it's really, again, going back to whenever you look at like kind of the arc of history around how business has developed and leadership development, it really kind of came out of this factory manufacturing
Mhm.
mindset, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And
Fordism,
so it was
etc.
kind of widgets
Hmm.
produced, things like
Hmm.
that. And then kind of, that was kind of the early 1900s. And then we've kind of gotten into the 50s, 60s, 70s where it was more
Hmm.
process oriented.
Hmm.
I think what we've gone into now in the 21st century is understanding that people are the heart of what we do. People, if you don't have an engaged and happy employee, that's going to impact your performance more than anything else. And I
Right.
think we've also realized that the leadership paradigm is changing from the leader always knows what to do and always knows what's best to
Hmm.
really it's a collaboration. It's a
Hmm.
team. And so
Hmm.
how do we center people
Hmm.
in what we're doing and in our leadership practices
Hmm.
rather than profit or,
Hmm.
urgency or, whatever those are. Not saying those aren't important, but that people aren't the last part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
They're the first
I
part.
hear you. I hear you. In a past life, I was the same HR, a senior
Mhm,
HR professional. And, a decade ago, oftentimes it was just those types of conversations, right? So from a goal setting perspective, it was based around operations.
mhm,
From a departmental budgetary strategic perspective, it was the bottom line. From a training and development perspective, it was, do we have the cash flow to do it? And so,
mhm,
as you can see, the trend, it was around processing cash flow versus reinvesting in our people, which we're seeing now. The tide is slowly turning to a certain extent. And I think that's what you're pointing at, Sally, is
mhm,
that when we start to look at things from a human centric approach, it's just like work life integration, it's people operations integration.
mhm,
And from an Intuity performance perspective, we're really passionate about leadership operations integration, because it's one and the same. If you have that responsibility or that fiduciary responsibility to take care of your people, it's not just about driving the bottom line, the operations, but rather meeting your team members where they're at and looking around to say, okay, how can we either adapt, elevate, call them to a higher place? Because I don't think that there's many people out there that wake up and be like, hey, I'm aiming to do a crappy job today. It's more so around, I have barriers, or there's
mhm,
something else going on, or I have an opportunity to build my resiliency muscle or
mhm,
grit or what have you, right? So
mhm,
I think, Sally, we're talking the exact same language, just from different perspectives around
mhm,
systems and processes in HR, and then how does that integrate with leadership? I'm really interested to understand. So, from a landscape perspective, when it comes to the clients that you're currently working with,
mhm,
edging back into the thought process around transparency and trustworthiness,
mhm,
what are the biggest nuances or things that are coming up that relate to those topics? So, more around the how to
mhm.
side of things.
Yeah, that's great questions. I'll use kind of a couple of examples here.
Mm,
Is one, okay, I'll just use like a pay equity one and a transparency piece of, for instance, a organization may operate in a state within the United States where they've just passed some kind of pay transparency law. And so they're required legally to do, something around probably posting a job, a salary range within a job posting or something like that. And so kind of the conversations we'll have there is that are you posting information that other people have never seen before?
mm,
Right? And let's think about the impacts of that. So, are you posting? It's not just about following this legal compliance piece. It's also a greater conversation of you're opening up new information to the whole organization, and how can you do that in a thoughtful way,
absolutely.
in an intentional way, and
Hmm.
again, not just like check we're compliant, but also how can we open up more conversations about pay transparency
Mm,
in our organization and in ways that our leaders feel supported, right, in having those conversations. Like I run
mm,
into clients who, people the supervisors don't have access to their people's pay data. And so it's like, let's talk about that. Why is that? What? So that's kind of one example of like a transparency piece. And then I also then it leads quickly into trust, right? Of like on that front end of if you're sharing the pay information with a candidate that may be, coming and interviewing with your
mm,
organization, being able to have that conversation up front rather than the very last thing
absolutely.
is a trust building action,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's giving them, kind of a entry into your organization that's paving the way for trust rather than
Mm.
them, kind of feeling like, oh, they're already trying to hold information from me and I've not even accepted the job yet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what's coming to mind to me from a boots on the ground perspective is, what can you do organizations with regards to your pre-screening questions? And
Mhm,
then how do they lead into your interview process? So what I mean by that is in some circumstances, organizations can have pre-screening quizzes or a survey,
mhm,
which helps, bring up or bring out the strengths of candidates.
mhm,
And having kind of what we call in Canada B4, so bona fide occupation requirement questions,
mhm,
like can you lift so much, but also that
mhm,
pay equity piece, backing into what you
mhm,
were saying, Sally, is this job ranges from A and B. Is this a
mhm,
fit for you? That's one of the very
mhm,
first questions companies should be asking,
mhm,
instead of being like, okay, spend all your time with me and then we'll negotiate after the fact, right? Like it's a little bit older school thinking and
mhm,
not
mhm,
adverse to the human centric approach. The boots on the ground secondary piece to that is what I'm hearing is from the pre-screening to the interview process. Then up front, you're talking about the pre-screening, almost like a debrief, to be like,
mhm,
hey, I received your pre-screening information, loving it. I want to know more. Just checking in. When it comes to this pay side of things, we're very transparent as an organization, wanting to know some anecdotal things from you. How does this land with you? So just
mhm,
simple conversational questions. It doesn't need to be an awkward conversation. The other important thing that I was hearing in there was when it comes to starting a new process in HR, I feel like many organizations forget, and I don't know what this is dubbed. I don't know what you would call it. So I'm just going to stumble here a little bit, Sally, but it's almost like HR strategic communications.
mhm,
So
mhm,
HR really needs to partner with operations to be like, okay, so if we're going to roll out this information, is the timing correct? Number one.
mhm,
Or did we just do a mass layoff and now we're going to talk about pay, right? Like,
mhm,
anecdotally, we need to be in the right space for our team members. And that's a human centric
mhm,
approach coming into play.
mhm,
Then it's like, okay, what's our communication plan? Who needs to know first? Who needs to
mhm,
know from a leadership perspective, two layers, a leadership or managerial perspective, and then our whole team organization. And by the
mhm,
way, is there an opportunity for us to allow our teams to ask questions and
mhm,
making sure that our leaders feel secure and safe to answer said question? So I feel like it's a whole process that organizations can utilize as low hanging fruit, to ensure that the transparency is falling exactly where they need it to from a win-win perspective. So you're thinking about it from a greater good, because if you're going from an organization of perceived distrust and perceived lack of transparency, whether it is or not, to
mhm.
full-blown opening the doors to certain things that archaically have never been open to in past, that's a big step for many of your long-term employees, right? So, and I think that's
Mhm.
what you're getting at from a how-to lens, I guess.
Yeah, plus one to everything you just said. And I will say definitely what I also find is, kind of going in and doing the specific pay equity work. But I mean, kind of, I also do like strategic planning and things like that, is that a
Mm,
lot of times there will be employees who've been there for a long time and they've had experiences where the organization hasn't handled stuff well and
right.
they're still holding on to it, right?
It happens.
Because nobody's ever talked about it.
Absolutely.
And so, sometimes it'll be, I'll find resistance with an organization because they're like, employees will be like, I do not trust the organization to take care of me. You know, I'm just here for a paycheck, whatever. And it's like, okay, like it's just kind of acknowledging, I see you, I hear
Mm,
you, I know that's
mm,
where you are. I know that's kind of been, you know, the past experience. What would an experience that's meaningful and helpful to you look like? So we can make sure and approach this in a way that does look different
mhm,
than what we've
mhm.
done before. And again, it just can be like a simple conversation or just asking that questions. A lot of times people I find will kind of get into this and be like, oh my gosh, we have so much to change and so many conversations to have, and this is going to take so much work. And it's like, just kind of start small and just, kind of go from there and just work your way into it.
Mm. I like how you're breaking it down from the perspective of more of a coach approach with the
Mhm.
team members and meeting them where they're at, as well as taking bite-sized snippets and understanding that this is a whole journey when it comes to transparency, excuse me, and trustworthiness, in
Mhm.
that it's something that needs to be integrated with everyday life, which means that there's a
Mhm.
continuing program. It's not one or done, essentially, is what I think I'm hearing.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. For me, like when you look at the definition of trust, there are a lot of definitions.
Mm,
But for me, I experience trust as consistency.
mm,
Right? Is so if
that
you're a
resonates.
leader, right? If you're a leader, if you're consistently showing up and consistently, whatever it is, that's action building, that's trust building actions for people, right?
Mhm,
Is
mhm,
that this person's going to show up and still, ask the question or listen to me, or they're going to, whatever, bring this forward. And that's a way you can continuously build trust with your organization, because it's easy as a leader to kind of go silent or whatever because you got your own work,
mhm.
or whatever. But if you're consistently showing up, consistently being in a team meeting, whatever, that is really going to reflect something powerful to your employees.
Absolutely. And to add to that, Sally, I think what you're pointing to is that all companies have history.
Hmm.
And in continuing to leverage or elevate trust, just being vulnerable as a leader and being like, hey, I'm trying something new for the department, for the organization, for the team, whatever it may be, and being fully transparent about their intent.
Hmm.
Because if we're coming from a place where trust is a little bit sketchy or non-consistent, utilizing some of your words, Sally,
Hmm.
there needs to be, I feel, a higher level of vulnerability as to the intent and setting things up for success so that change can happen. So I feel like there's a
Hmm.
change catalyst piece.
Hmm.
The other thing that was coming up for me as you were speaking is I feel leaders want to do the best job when it comes to trust and transparency. But the bigger challenge is that these are really broad topics and they're subjective. And it's
Hmm.
kind of like what's the manual to this stuff called trust?
Hmm.
Isn't it
Hmm.
warm and fuzzy? And by the way, how often do I have to do this? And some days I just don't feel like it. And that's all
Hmm.
okay as a leader
Hmm.
because, when I feel of the leadership journey, it's not just a hockey stick approach in the sense of growth. It's almost like this dipsy doodle kind of graph
Hmm.
that, as long as you're increasing by 1%, that's great. And so, all this to say, I feel like leaders have an opportunity to be vulnerable when it comes to building transparency and trust, as well as setting context. Um, because I feel like that's a huge tool in a tool belt to leverage the change if you're trying to turn that proverbial ship.
I totally agree with you on that. And I think, a couple of things to kind of give, like, kind of the how to, like the toolkit,
Mm,
you were talking about is one is I encourage any SA supervisor, leader, whatever term you use, is to work with your team on a set of team agreements of like, how are you going to show up
mm,
to work? And these have definitely become kind of more popular in a hybrid and remote working thing, but just have a conversation that, you're just saying, okay, here's kind of the, hours in the day that everybody's going to be responsive to email. Here are the, we commit to, and I'm using kind of some technology based ones, but there's a lot more than that. We rotate facilitators for our team meetings. You need to have agenda items in by whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different ones, but like, is there kind of a phrase to say, hey, I am, struggling today or whatever, and I just kind of need to be quiet, whatever it is. And just
Mm,
having those team agreements that you build together and
mhm,
evolve over time. So
mm,
thinking about checking in with those maybe quarterly or, twice a year. And then every time your team changes, a person changes in the team, those agreements are going to change because you're bringing in a fully dynamic human being that brings in something
absolutely.
different, right? And
Mhm.
then the other kind of how to, we'll usually tell with leaders is be in community with other leaders.
Mm,
Just be, somebody maybe it may not be at your organization, you may not be big enough, to have a peer in your or whatever that
yeah.
but a place where you can kind of confidentially talk about stuff.
Mhm.
Coaching's a great place, like kind of your leadership cohort program. I mean, being in community helps you see that you're not alone and you can
Yes.
learn from other people's experiences.
Yes, absolutely. You nailed it. And, there's multiple ways that we can look at that from the perspective of, if there's, multiple leaders within an organization, what can you do collectively as a group? and
Mm-hmm.
and I don't mean build who can build the highest tower from a warm and
Mm-hmm.
fuzzy team engagement perspective, but rather, you know is there a way that we can have internal meetings and talk about our leadership competencies and objectives? And what I mean by that is, as a leadership group, how do we want to intentionally show up for our team members? And further to that, what does that mean from an operational perspective? So again, looking at it from that workplace, or excuse me, leadership and operational integration. And I really like what you're talking about in the sense of the how-tos around community commitments or team commitments, because it's really
Mm-hmm.
important. And what I've seen is two-pronged. So from the commitment perspective, your individual team members have buy-in, like they take those things
Mm-hmm.
seriously, and it's something that you can easily talk about instead of being like, oh gosh, I have to have this negative or hard conversation about accountability. No,
Mm-hmm.
we've collectively communicated as a group around
Mm-hmm.
accountability. So it's just simply asking the question, hey Ange, can I check in with you around this project, specifically the accountability piece? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece to that kind of came up for me was, when it comes to the leadership side of things, it's ensuring that leaders are equipped with understanding what impacts transparency and trustworthiness have. And so I want to kind of put you on the hot seat,
Mm-hmm.
Sally. When you're working with your clients, what type of anecdotal things can you tell us that trustworthiness and transparency really impact on a day-to-day basis?
Great question. These are all great questions. Thank you. I will say a couple of things. One is just thinking about like when you're in a meeting with someone, prioritize connection first rather
Mm,
than just jumping right into the task list. And it can
mhm.
just be, as like you said, it doesn't have to be stacking some kind of elaborate team building activity. Just be like, hey, how you feeling? What's your goal for this meeting?
Yep,
That's it. you
yep,
know, or what would success look like at the end of this meeting? I mean, just
absolutely.
simple things. Again, kind of building a practice, building a muscle towards doing that so that you're seeing that person as a human first, versus, the task list they have behind them, right? So I think
Mm,
that's trust building actions. I think as a leader, trying to be very intentional about having times that you check in with your individual team members and then as a team where it's not doesn't always have to be like we're going through
mm,
project list, you
mhm,
know. I think also is thinking about, as a leader, it may require you to slow down a little bit. And
mhm.
that's super hard. I don't know how y'all, everybody feels listening to this, but I feel like this year, like it is like the world turned back on double speed. And so it's really hard to slow down and be like, "Hey, I need a minute. I
Mhm,
need a day to
mhm,
review this, or I need and so to the point you were talking about, setting up some of those expectations ahead of time of like, for instance, if you as a team need to do like a project review, being able to kind of send the information you're going to ask for a couple of days ahead if you can,
mm,
then having the meeting about it, then giving people a couple of days afterwards to anything that pops up after that kind of elongates that process a little bit.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't seem possible anymore for us to knock everything out in one session. We might have a really good working session together as a team, but like there's going to be other stuff that our minds are thinking about as we process what's happened.
Absolutely.
So opening up the space for that to happen, I think, is really important.
Definitely. And I think too, layering into that from a leadership perspective, it's really being able to read your room, because
Mm,
oftentimes what we can see is that leaders want to push something forward, which is fantastic, right? However, if your team members aren't there with you, maybe they need more resources, maybe they need to unpack something or problem solve, or they need you to help set a pace that is comparable more so to a slower speed,
mhm,
then it's again coming back to the thought process of reading the room so that you can positively induce stress. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when it comes to employee engagement, from a neuroscience perspective, it's the hormones that your leadership impacts, right? So we
mhm,
all have these things going on in our brains every single day. And all this to say is that when you're reading the room as a leader, you're picking up on cues around, is it time for me to slam on the brakes and ask questions
mhm,
so that I can see where my team's at?
mhm,
Or do I need to call them higher and be like, all right, let's pick up the pace here. And what can we do to get XYZ out the door? Or what do we
mhm.
actually need to do to problem solve this? Because sometimes when we're working in silos, especially remotely, it can be quite challenging getting past some obstacles that kind of come up for ourselves, either internally or sometimes as a team.
Yeah, I love that. There's a term that we have used in organization development of the leader observer, that you're playing both
Mm,
of those roles at the same time. Sometimes it's called facilitator observer, but that you're not only there and, maybe, facilitating a process or leading a meeting or something, but you're also observing what's happening in the room. So very much like what you were just talking about, the reading the room. So you're seeing who's checked out. Is it quiet? Are people feeling disengaged? You know, can you feel, for me sometimes on Zoom when I'm facilitating, I can kind of feel it when people are chatting it up in alternative streams than what we're facilitating. I'm
yes,
like,
yes.
I feel like something's going on here, and depending on the group and the level of trust I have with the group, I might be able to call that out, or I might just be able to say, hey, what's going on with the quiet? Or,
Mm,
just again, and that building that trust with a group takes time. So I'm not going to do that
absolutely.
with a group I'm just started with, right? That's going to be one I've met with several times.
Definitely. How do you influence teams? Sorry, let me back it up. You had mentioned earlier something that really resonated with me in the sense, Sally, that it's really important for leadership, and I'm reading between the lines as well. It's really
Mhm.
important for leadership and teams to be able to take that pause and reflect.
Mhm.
And so, how, as a service based provider consultant, how do you
Mhm.
offer tools to your clients so that they can do just that, or even
Mhm.
raise the self awareness that it's needed?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because that reflection has been a practice that I've had to build. It's not been,
Mm,
kind of my own self journey of interior work and understanding. I'm very action oriented. I like to speed through things. I like to kind of tie everything up in a nice bow at the end, and have a sense of completion. And so reflection has been one of those practices that's been really helpful for me, because I've been able to kind of get deeper into my brain and
mm,
into my thinking processes. So
mm,
how I, as a consultant, how that shows up is that, one is like if I'm coaching, and whether it's kind of like a formal coaching relationship, or I'm working with a client and we just kind of do informal coaching based on, what's going on, is I'm going to say, let's stop and reflect on a question together. Or let's just tell me, just take this question, chew on it for a day and come back to me. I
mm,
also sometimes, whenever we give reports to our clients, like, maybe it's a landscape assessment for a strategic plan, or maybe it's focus group information. I will usually tell them, I'm giving this to you, and I don't want to hear from you for 2 days,
mm,
because I just need you to digest it.
mhm. Mhm.
And then kind of the other practice is one thing I use this in my own personal practice, even just myself, but also in the teams in which I work, is a retrospective meeting on every project. Is just saying, what was the purpose? What went well? What would we have changed? And what are some learnings we might take forward?
Mhm.
So, and learnings forward could be like, I would have structured that differently, or maybe I would have asked this question earlier in the process. I mean, stuff
Right.
as simple as that, right?
Right. Right.
But just having that practice of always kind of having that closeout of like a project or a unit of work
Mhm.
is really helpful to be like, okay, we're learning forward.
Mhm.
We're not just going to kind of go past it and not learn from what we're doing.
Absolutely. And what would you say to your clients thinking about transparency and trust?
Hmm.
And on that topic of learn forward, what would you say are the top three things that they need to practice to ensure that we're learning forward or we're leaning forward minimally?
Would you say like kind of as within a team context or as a leader kind of individually?
I like that thought process. I would say all three, but we'd be here all afternoon. Let's take it
Hmm.
from the leadership lens.
Okay. For me, I would say kind of the top three. One is to get really comfortable with taking a breath before you
Mm,
speak.
mhm,
Or, I intentionally count to seven very slowly when I'm facilitating because I'm the type who just kind of will move fast and other people need time. So I think there's, again, kind of building that pause within us is super helpful. I think also kind of building the learning forward is having the practice, right? It's just
mhm,
regularly kind of having those like, hey, we're going to do this after every, whatever it is. I don't know what the pace would be in your organization, but for me, it works with clients at the end of a client project. And whenever I have like a client project that's 9 months, I may do that every 3 months, the
mhm,
retrospective and be building it over time so I don't lose some of the learnings, over a 9 month period. I may not be able to recall everything over a 9 month period. So I think, just having a consistent practice
mhm,
is
mhm,
really helpful. And then I think being willing to admit your own mistakes and take
mhm,
ownership for them is really
mhm.
powerful because then your teammates feel a sense of comfort in admitting their own mistakes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I almost feel like, Sally, there could be a part two to this podcast.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
I love that you're game. So, Sally,
Hmm.
before we leave you today, tell us a little bit more. Where can we find you?
Hmm.
A little bit specifically about your services. If you have anything going on that we should know about in the next couple
Yeah.
months.
Thank you so much. I am always on LinkedIn, so would love for you to find me there. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, personally and my Loftis Partners firm, but you can find me Sally Loftis. On LinkedIn, I also publish kind of a monthly newsletter called Fully Human Resources that talks a lot about the people positive approaches
Amazing.
that we can take. And, we have the Loftus Partners website where also have a blog that I contribute to pretty regularly. Some things that you can definitely kind of opt into with us is that I have some learning groups that operate at different times around kind of in the DEI space. So
Mhm,
signing up for our monthly newsletter really kind of helps you opt into those and know when those are happening. And also will offer free trainings at different points in the year. So I would love for people to kind of sign up for the monthly newsletter to get those because we really kind of want to build capacity in multiple ways. And that's the best way to kind of get connected to what we're doing.
mhm. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your views today with us, as well as how you can help organizations with regards to DEI, strategic, with a human-centric approach.
Thank you. I
Thank,
appreciate your having me.
yeah, my pleasure. Take good care.
Thanks.